My name is Amelia. I wasn't raised in a wealthy household, but I somehow managed to land a job and even get married. My husband's name is Edward, and he works at a luxury hotel. I really thought I was going to have a happily ever after, but I never imagined it would end up like this. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that my childhood home was below average in terms of wealth. I was brought up in such a home, but I don't hold even a speck of resentment towards my parents. They gave up all their luxuries for me, took me places to play, and taught me about the different cultures of those places. I wonder if they loved geography, but as a child, I often thought they were trying too hard for my sake. I didn't want to make my parents go through any more trouble for me, so I decided that I would work as soon as I graduated from middle school. My mother would say to me, "You really should at least finish high school. It might be tough to find a job in the future." And my father would add, "That's right. We have enough saved to send you to high school." I was really happy about their feelings, but even more than that, I had a strong desire to make life easier for my parents as soon as possible. "It's all right. The sooner I start working, the sooner I'll start earning more," I said with little certainty. But just like my parents said, there was no guarantee that I would be able to find a job anywhere. At that time, I had a friend who was a foreign girl who had immigrated when we started middle school. Her name was Jessica, and like me, her family wasn't rich. Maybe that's why we got along so well and always played together. Since Jessica could speak some English, we managed to have conversations. Without realizing it, I was learning Spanish while talking with her. By the time I was in the 9th grade, I could hold conversations in Spanish pretty well. Perhaps it was my Spanish skills that did it because, lo and behold, a certain travel agency decided to hire me. They saw value in my ability to speak Spanish. Jessica and I, having both left school after junior high, began working and gradually lost touch. But I was single-minded in my work, determined to earn money. As time flew by, I found myself at 26 years old. There was a lounge in a hotel that I frequently used for work. It was a high-end place, but cozy, and the snacks and coffee menu were reasonably priced. We could have our meetings there with the staff. At that time, the waiter working there was Edward. The hotel hosted many foreigners, so he seemed to speak Spanish as well. Sometimes I would be there with foreign guests, too. Maybe it was because we both spoke Spanish, but something just clicked between us. Edward struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we were in a whirlwind romance that led to marriage. For a girl from a poor family to get married, it's quite a deep feeling when you think about it. Regardless, I was expecting to start a new and exciting life. However, the reality turned out to be the exact opposite. When we were getting married, Edward had a request. "If it's okay with you, Amelia, I'd like to live within my family home." The reason was that Edward had lost his father a few years back, and he was worried about his mother living alone. His mother's energy levels were dipping, and it seemed like a good idea to have someone watch over her. At the time, I was a remote worker who could do my job from home. I guess that's why Edward thought it would be convenient, since I was always home to keep an eye on his mother and manage the household chores. On the flip side, Edward often had long hours at work and wasn't home much. With his scarce days off, having me, a home-based worker, around must have seemed like a good arrangement to him. But I couldn't immediately agree to it. That's because when I first went to Edward's family home to introduce myself before marrying him, his mother had gone silent after asking about my education. "Amelia, which university did you graduate from?" she asked. When I honestly replied, "Well, I didn't go to college. I only finished middle school," my mother-in-law just looked at me in silence for a while. It was clear from her expression that she looked down on me. "Oh, middle school. Well, she said, eyeing me with disdain. Given this history, I figured living with her wouldn't go very smoothly, so I mentioned it to Edward casually. "Edward, don't you think your mom doesn't exactly see me in the best light?" When I asked, he chuckled a bit and said, "Nah, that's not true. Mom trusts me, and I'm sure she's got no bad feelings toward my wife either." Hearing that made me think maybe I was overthinking things. Edward also promised that if anything came up, he'd speak to his mother on my behalf. With that assurance, I agreed to move in with his family. But once I actually started living there, things were far from perfect. It was like a slap of reality. Whenever Edward and I visited his family's house, his mother would speak to him with such warmth. "Edward, thank you. I'm so grateful you're living with me," she would say, and Edward would respond, "Of course, I knew it would help you out." From my perspective, they seemed like such a close mother and son. But towards me, my mother-in-law's attitude was completely different, cold even. "Well, Amelia, just make sure you don't hold Edward back," she'd say emotionlessly, as if she was instructing a servant. It was clear she still looked down on me. I couldn't help but think that. But at that moment, Edward stood up for me. "Don't worry, Amelia is doing a great job working too," he said. But when I mentioned this, my mother-in-law momentarily turned stern, a detail I did not miss. I figured I should just speak to Edward if things ever got troublesome, and decided to handle it my way, thinking things would work out since we were living together. We were family after all, and I didn't want any weird vibes between us. That's the spirit with which we started our cohabitation, but reality, as it often does, didn't quite bend in a favorable direction. Once, as I was working on my computer as usual, my mother-in-law barged into my room and said rather angrily, "Hey, Amelia, when are you going to clean my room? It needs to be done by 10 o'clock a.m. every day." I was taken aback since I had never heard of such a rule. Sure, I agreed to do household chores, but we never discussed to what extent. If she had just kindly told me from the beginning, that would have been fine. After all, I have my own job and can't be available all the time. However, arguing wouldn't be mature, so I quickly wrapped up my work, apologized, and started cleaning her room. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law was just lounging in the living room, watching TV and munching on snacks. Edward had expressed concerns about his mother's health, but she seemed well enough to clean her own room. I had imagined she might struggle with walking, but she was more sprightly than I thought. Once the cleaning was done, she was already commanding, "Now get started on dinner, and I like it bland. I won't stand for anything too strong." She even told me to go shopping for ingredients right away. I thought it was too early to start prepping, but figured I'd get it done and go back to my work. When I returned from shopping, my mother-in-law was surprisingly still slacking off. It's hard not to get annoyed, but I chose to hold back and just get things done, probably being tested by her. I believed she'd understand in time, but that hope lingered for months on end. There were days when the complaint was that I was 5 minutes late in getting the laundry in, or that the bathtub wasn't cleaned properly, nitpicking to an almost obsessive degree. Before I knew it, I ended up doing all the chores around the house, and yet my mother-in-law just lay around at her leisure. Honestly, if she has the energy to nitpick, she could very well do some chores herself. I started to worry that if this kept up, it would start affecting my job too. That was the last thing I needed, so I decided to wait until the evening to talk to Edward about it. Once my mother-in-law had gone to bed, I told him everything. "Hey, I think your mom just doesn't like me. I'm getting so tired of being constantly criticized." But Edward just chuckled and said, "Come on, that can't be true. Mom's a kind person. There won't be any issues as long as Amelia doesn't do anything strange. Please try to get along with her." He just wouldn't believe me. Maybe it's because she's always doting on him and never complains to him. In fact, when Edward's around, my mother-in-law says, "Amelia, why don't you take a break and have some tea?" But even knowing that, there's a limit to my patience with this kind of life. I'm chased by household chores all day and end up having to work on my job at night. To be honest, my trust in Edward is starting to fade. If nothing changes, I might just collapse from all the stress. Then, in the midst of all this, my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell. "Amelia, I'll be away for about a week in about 3 months from now, so make sure you keep the house in order, okay?" She sprang this on me out of nowhere. When I asked what was going on, she said, "Edward suggested we go on an overseas vacation. That's my boy, always knowing how much I love traveling abroad. I'm looking forward to it." I was stunned because Edward hadn't mentioned a word of this to me, and to top it off, it sounded like I was being left out, expected to stay behind and manage the house. I needed to talk to Edward about this right away, so I brought it up that night. His response was, "Oh, Mom already told you? But you're coming too, right?" It turned out we had our wires crossed. It seems my mother-in-law had lied to me. Even if Edward wants me to go, there's no way I can enjoy a trip with her. In frustration, I told him, "I don't want to go. I can't possibly have a good time with your mother." Then Edward completely lost it and lashed out. "Amelia, what the heck are you saying? How long are you going to keep up this childish nonsense? I won't allow you to speak ill of Mom like that. You better reflect on this. It's a vacation abroad, for crying out loud, and I want to enjoy it too," he retorted. I was just shocked. I couldn't believe he wouldn't trust me this far. With things like this, staying in this house had become nothing but agony for me. To prove to Edward that what I was saying was true, I decided to take action. The next day, Edward was off work, so the three of us were having breakfast together. That's when I challenged my mother-in-law. "You're trying to exclude me from the trip abroad, aren't you?" My mother-in-law replied with a defiant tone, "Oh, did I say that? Amelia, if you want to come, you should just come along, right?" But Edward interjected, "Hey, Amelia, don't you get it yet? Apologize to Mom. Why are you being so defiant? You're not a child anymore." Even so, what I said was the truth. I had a strong desire to clear everything up and really wanted Edward to understand. But before I could argue back, my mother-in-law gave me the worst insult. "Well, maybe Amelia should just stay home, right? It's too early for someone like you to travel abroad. You won't appreciate the experience with your lack of education. Besides, lazing around at home every day without working. Do you even deserve to go abroad? You know it, don't you?" I was floored to think she still believed I was unemployed. I've explained about my job, even during our greetings. I've told you what my job is, haven't I? When I confronted her, she looked down on me. "What job? Remote work? Don't joke with me. You're just playing on the computer at home. It's been getting on my nerves every day. There's no way you're making money with that. You're just stealing Edward's earnings." She blurted that out, and it really made me mad. But before I could retort, she went even further. "I have Edward, and that's enough for me. Edward can speak Spanish and works at a renowned hotel. There's no need to waste his earnings on a woman like you. Uneducated and unemployed. A bottom feeder like you should just leave as soon as possible." She just went on and on. After all her tirades, Edward must have finally understood what I was saying. As I looked at him, he made an unexpected remark. "Well, I can understand how Mom feels. Maybe Amelia needs to cool off a bit," he said nonchalantly, as if he was fed up with me. At that moment, I made up my mind. I couldn't continue living with these two anymore. My mother-in-law told me to get out, but I still wanted to confirm. "Am I really supposed to leave?" I asked. Laughing, she replied, "Of course. Leave as soon as you can. We don't need bottom feeders like you around." So I said, "Understood," and started preparing to move out. I just nodded to the two of them and left the house. As I was leaving, my mother-in-law called after me with a sneer, "Enjoy your poor life as it suits a bottom feeder like you." But what they didn't realize was that retribution was coming their way. About 3 months after I left, around the time when they were scheduled to go on their trip abroad, my mother-in-law called me. "Amelia, I finally got through to you. What in the world is going on?" She sounded quite frantic. "First," I said, "I'm surprised you managed to call this number. she replied. "Of course, I tried several times and couldn't get through. I even called your parents' house to get your new number. I had told my parents that if either Edward or my mother-in-law called, they should give them this number." "What's wrong?" I asked in a calm tone, despite her panic. She said, "What's wrong? We're getting all sorts of collection letters. Help me out, I didn't know about any of this." "Well, that's expected. You haven't been paying the utilities, have you?" I simply answered. My mother-in-law seemed to be in a world of her own. I had absolutely thought Edward was covering our living expenses. To find out you were paying for everything. "Why didn't you tell me? I had no idea you were making that much money," she exclaimed. "It's kind of too late to be bringing this up now," I said, but maybe Edward finally told her the truth. By then, I had already started my own business, using the expertise I gained from the travel agency I used to work for. It had grown to the point where I was earning $20 million, with my services being widely accepted around the world. What shocked my mother-in-law even more was probably Edward's actual income. Just because he worked in a lounge at a well-known hotel didn't mean he was raking in the cash. In reality, Edward was just an average Joe on the payroll, on the lower end, I'd say. And speaking Spanish at that hotel was nothing special. It was crawling with Spanish speakers. Even if he could speak it, it wasn't anything to write home about. There's no way his income could cover the living expenses for 3 people. In reality, just making ends meet for himself was all he could manage. It was ridiculous that she hadn't realized until a collection notice came that I was the one paying all the living expenses for my husband's family. But the more I listened to my mother-in-law, the more appalling facts came to light. The reason why she insisted on me living with them wasn't to keep an eye on me. It was because she had been living off my father-in-law's wealth. Blinded by a temporary influx of cash, she had spent lavishly until there was nothing left. That's when she turned to Edward, presuming he was earning well. But Edward knew his income was low and was somewhat aware of my earnings, which is why he turned to me for help. Hearing this just reconfirmed what a hopeless pair they were. But their irresponsibility didn't end there. "By the way, are you managing to make the card payments?" she asked, raising her voice. "Exactly. Both Edward and I have bills piling up since you moved out. I've started to receive more and more credit card statements addressed to both of us. The amounts due each month keep climbing, and before I knew it, they amounted to quite a sum. The level of their luxury spending was beyond me. I had no idea what they were doing without paying the living expenses, but Edward's bills had surpassed his salary, and my mother-in-law hadn't kicked her old habits of lavish spending. They both had gotten themselves into debt now totaling over $440,000. What was more shocking is they thought Edward would somehow manage it if it was just a bit of debt, as my mother-in-law put it, and Edward thought I would take care of it if things got tough. The level of dependency in grown adults was appalling. Beyond exasperation, I was starting to feel the danger. So when my mother-in-law brazenly said, "So, Amelia, you can sort this out for us, right?" I was astonished she could be so audacious. I made it clear to her, "After all that's been said and done, you're asking for help now." "There's no way I'm helping." That's when Edward suddenly took the phone. "Hey, Amelia, you're my wife. You have a duty to help us out. Do something. We can't pay this off." I couldn't fathom their nerve, but I did offer him a glimmer of mercy. "So you want to come over? I might consider it if you do." He was immediately enthusiastic. "Oh, yeah? You'll let us stay and you'll sort out the money. Then let's do that. Where's your place?" "I'll head there right now," he said eagerly. I had to be honest. "Well, if you can make it, I'm in Hawaii right now. I have a vacation home here," I said. Both Edward and my mother-in-law couldn't hide their shock. "What do you mean, Hawaii?" "We can't afford to go there right now," Edward panicked. I calmly replied, "Weren't you going to travel abroad? Just swing by Hawaii. Your mother would love it. And you did ask my family for my phone number, right? Didn't you realize it was an international number? I added, "Oh, and don't forget the cost of this call. It adds up if you're on for a long time." To drive the point home, I said, "If we get divorced, I might think about helping with the money too." Edward was quick to reply, "All right, I got it. Let's just get divorced first then." He seemed to have realized his debts were not something he could exchange for anything. So I told him I'd deliver the divorce papers once I got back to California and ended the call. About a week later, I had returned to California, made sure to have the divorce papers properly written up, and the divorce went through without a hitch. Edward looked quite gaunt, so I guess he'd been living pretty lean these last few days. He mentioned something at that time. It turns out he had been counting on my money for the overseas trip as well. Hearing that didn't even surprise me anymore. They probably thought I would pay off their debts, but of course I had no intention whatsoever of doing that. What I proposed was, first of all, for both of them to stop living so lavishly, and then for Edward and my mother-in-law to work their tails off. I told them if they did, they could eventually pay off the debt and at least manage the bare necessities. When Edward heard this, he lashed out, "Hey, that's not what you promised. You were supposed to think about the debt." But I was like, "That's why I did you a favor by thinking of a way for you guys to handle your debt repayment. So, good luck. Once you can afford to travel abroad again, I'll invite you to my Hawaii villa," I said with a touch of sarcasm, and left their place. Afterward, they both seemed to be working themselves to the bone from dawn till dusk, barely scraping by. It's probably a good lesson for them since they've had it easy until now. On a different note, I heard that Jessica also built a house in Hawaii. I had a reunion with her after so long. She took up a job that took her around the world after graduating from middle school, and now seems to be a company president. Just like me, she had her parents come over to the house she bought, and they are living it up together. So I called my parents over from California, and we started living here. Now I sometimes visit Jessica's place. We both feel blessed to be able to give back to our parents and encourage each other as we work hard at our jobs.